Hey guys, welcome. So I added these topics, just two brief demos to show a bit of progress with Elsa 3. Question that was asked, I think today or yesterday, about custom activity icons for Elsa 2. So I thought maybe that's interesting to take a quick look at. So I will start with that. So the scenario is as follows. Let's say you have a custom activity.
Don't forget to share the screen.
So as I was saying, let's imagine we have a custom activity in Elsa 2. I don't know if this is Elsa 2. One sec. Yeah, this is it. So there's a sample project called Elsa sample server host, and there's a sample activity. We looked at this one last week when we looked at cascading dropdowns, and now let's say we want to add a custom activity icon for this activity. So from the C# end, there's nothing to do, but what you need to do is create a JavaScript function that represents a Elsa designer plugin, and then somehow use it to install a custom icon for this activity type called vehicle activity. So that's the goal. So let's switch over to the designer project. Now, of course, you as an activity developer, you do not need to work directly in the source code of the designer. You would just use whatever project you're hosting the designer in, and then there will be a bit of JavaScript that you need to write. And here I'm just showing what a JavaScript may look like using vanilla JS. And of course, you could also use TypeScript, but I will show how to do it with vanilla JS. Not using this project. This is the Elsa 3 designer project. So let me open the Elsa 2 project. So here we are in the index.html. And just to get our bearings a little bit of what this file is about, at root it just hosts the custom component. And when we have a handle of this component, we can actually install plugins into it. And that is shown at the very bottom of this file. So here what we do, we get a handle of the Elsa Studio root element. Then we attach an event handler for the initializing event, and that happens once. And during that event, we register a bunch of plugins. One of these plugins is a custom plugin called the vehicle activity plugin. We also looked at this last week. This is code related to the cascading dropdowns. But what we are interested in is this part here, where we have some HTML representing an icon, and using the activity icon provider service to register a custom icon for a given activity type. So very easy to use, and I'll show what that looks like. So let's add a custom activity called vehicle activity, and as you see here, it's using the custom icon, and that's it. All right, so let's move on to the Elsa 3 stuff. A bunch of work has gone in. There's a new feature called labels, and it's very similar to GitHub labels, where you can on GitHub you can create labels and then assign them to issues. Similarly, for Elsa 3, you will be able to define labels and assign them to workflows, workflow definitions to be specific. And this could be useful to group certain workflows together and then be able to query on those labels. So here we are looking at the Elsa 3 workflow designer, and there's a new menu item here called labels with a simple UI to be able to add new labels. So for example, label 1, some description and some color. There's no color picker yet, but that will be added at a later point. And this way we can add a bunch of them. So let's add a few more. So I use tailwindcss.com as my color picker of choice. Here there's a preview of the color. This is good. And let's add one more. All right, so now we have 3 labels, and here we have a workflow. And now we can actually assign those labels. Very easy. Yeah, and then the next step, this is yet to be implemented, is to then be able to filter by these labels from the workflow definition UI. So right now there's just a complete list of workflow definitions. We're working on having this paginated with check marks so that you can perform bulk actions like bulk publish and delete, retract, that kind of thing. And of course a label picker at the top to allow you to filter by labels.
The color that you picked, is that the font color and not the background color? You put some other logic to it to have it a bit lighter? Or?
Yeah, that's a keen observation indeed. So the color you see here is not the exact color that was picked. So what happens is I make this color a little bit darker, I think, or I use the same color. I'm not sure. I played around with it, so I don't know what the final result is. We can take a look. And the background color is lightened. So it's using a JavaScript function to format. Let's take a quick look. Yeah, so the forecolor, the text color, is the color you specify, and then the background color is lightened by an amount of 55, whatever that means, using a JavaScript library called tinycolor. And then I generate a inline style for this element here.
So what happens if I pick white?
then the background will be white as well. So you will see nothing. So let's try it. Yeah, maybe we can make it smarter by having rotating color. So if it exceeds the maximum lightness, then maybe it should rotate to dark so that the background is dark and the foreground is light. Maybe there's some algorithms we can try.
Yeah, maybe by contrast or having some border.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually what GitHub does. They also add a border slightly darker than the background, but also slightly lighter than the foreground, I believe. So yeah, it can be tweaked. All right. And then the list API for the workflow definition resource was updated to allow you to query by label. So as you can see here, I'm using two query string parameters, both called label. So here I want to filter all workflow definitions by label customer and documents. Now I don't have these labels, so that means I should no results should be returned, but this is a bug I'm still working on. But the end goal is for this to be an AND query. If you specify this condition and none of the workflow definitions match that criteria, obviously you shouldn't see any items. So that's a work to be done. So that's largely implemented, but the way it was implemented, it was not added to the core. As you may know, in Elsa 3, takes a more decoupled, layered approach, but the label management and the UI, etc., is still in one of these layers baked in. But what I want to try to do is create a separate module just for label management and the querying thereof as an experiment to further decouple various aspects of this library so that I will encounter certain aspects that need to be more extensible. So for example, the front end would need to be opened up to developers so that they can install their own little widgets in this designer. So for example, this menu needs to be extensible. These sections here should be extensible so that plugin developers can install their own little functionality. So that's gonna be one of the next things for me. And then once that's in place, I intend to actually work on creating custom activities from the designer. And to start with, you should be able to create new composite activities using the designer. So this will be mini workflows using the same flowchart style visual designer. And then ultimately we will also have a sequence workflow designer, similar to Workflow Foundation, but also think of modules like a module that allows you to create JavaScript functions or snippets of JavaScript code that represent activities. So you can use the designer to write new activities on the fly using JavaScript syntax. And then those activities will be available from the activity picker. Probably in that order, that's what I'll be working on next. And then finally, I'm hoping to get started with the sequence activity editor.
Maybe we discussed this in an earlier session, but I've forgotten. Is there a plan to extend the execution of the activity itself that you can extend on like pipeline for each activity? The reason I'm asking is that maybe you want to do a transformation prior to the execution for a certain variable and also on the output make some transformations on the object that it's generated. Do you see that as a composite activity?
So we did talk about middleware some meetings ago, but that's more like action filters that will execute in this context it would execute for every activity. But of course some middleware in a pipeline could be specific to some activity that can perform an action before the activity executes and after it executes. But what would be interesting is indeed as custom activity developer to be able to implement a middleware pipeline for just a specific activity and then maybe extend it to the designer. So you could write JavaScript, for example, to execute code before a certain activity executes and after. So maybe on any activity, let's say there's a write line, and would you imagine there's some section in the designer where you can implement code that executes before the write line activity executes and after? Is that what you would be after, Frans?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I see in a lot of workflows that we're currently designing that we have to do an additional step just to do a little transformation in the object that we're handling in that workflow, just to accommodate the input requirements of that next activity and to make it more reusable. But on the other hand, I can see the logic in having a composite workflow or a composite activity there, which basically does that as well. So I was wondering, could there be any benefits in having that middleware on an activity, or is that already implemented when you use the composite activities?
Right. Yeah, so when you create a composite activity, then you have that functionality in place because the composite activity would consist of any number of activities in any configuration you need. So these would be like mini workflows. And then you can add them to the main workflow as single blocks. So then the low-level steps that you mentioned, the transformation step, for example, will be encapsulated in the custom activity. So that from the workflow point of view, you don't see these steps.
If that's the case, then there is no real reason to have a middleware on each activity, because you basically can do that.
Yeah, true.
Okay.
I proposed creating a new package. Let's take a look at that PR, because I kind of changed my mind on some part of that. So check this out. How cool is this? So this is in the designer syntax highlighting with IntelliSense with actual variables from the context. It's pretty cool. Yeah. So here I noticed that you created a new SQL handler in the Elsa core library, and then I suggested, well, like what we did with JavaScript and Liquid, they live in their own packets. So I suggested let's move this also to its own packets. But since we already have a SQL library, let's take a look at that. So here we have Elsa activity SQL, and the syntax highlighting is, I think, primarily used from these two activities. Of course, I'm not on your PR. But if that's the case, then maybe it makes sense for this library to expose this SQL handler. What do you think?
Yeah. So first, the reason that I kept it in the core library is because I found that the other handlers for JavaScript were in the same place. So I thought maybe this is the right place to keep it. But your point is also that to keep it in a separate project might be more suitable. Yeah, it could be in the SQL activities, but I think if someone also wants to create their own custom activity that has SQL syntax, it could be beneficial to have it in a more common place.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so here we have a scripting solution folder with the JavaScript and Liquid handler. So for the sake of reusability, as you just suggested, then maybe it makes sense to add a new scripting one. Yeah, so that's cool. Oh yeah, and I know that Jay is working on a generic solution allowing you to implement cascading dropdowns in the designer without writing any front-end code, but just declaratively define it from your activity code in C#. So that's going to be pretty cool as well. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have, except this is a new smaller featured copy buttons to copy these values. We're gonna make it a little bit better to provide user feedback. So when you click on the button, it changes to a check mark so that you have a visual indicator that it actually did something. And we have little tooltips over the activities. I don't know if I showed that last time. Yeah, so that's all I had. So thanks everyone for joining, and we'll catch up next week.